Drew, and thanks very much to everybody who joined us for the webinar today. So the title of our webinar is Selecting the Best Assessments and Programs to Support High Quality SEL for Youth and Adults. Our goals for today are to help you learn a little more about social emotional learning skills and frameworks, and to talk about tools that you can use to support youth and adults in your context. So today we'll be focusing on adult SEL programs, SEL classroom interventions, and SEL assessments. This webinar is based on a white paper that we've written called Selecting Assessments and Programs to Support High Quality SEL for Youth and Adults, and it will be available this fall. So here's a quick overview of the agenda. I'm going to start by introducing you to social emotional learning and programming. Tricia will then take over and tell you about SEL programming for adults and for youth. And then Steve and Nate will come in to tell you about universal screening assessments. And then we'll finish up with a quick review of the key takeaways, and there should be time at the end for some questions. Great. So let me start by telling you a little bit about the importance of social emotional learning. So we know that kids who have strong social emotional skills have positive outcomes, both in school and outside of school. For the school ones, they tend to have stronger school engagement and a stronger sense of belonging to their school. They have higher grades, less absenteeism, and they're also less likely to have problem behaviors in the classroom. And importantly, we know from our work and work in the SEL field more broadly that SEL skills can be taught, both in and out of school. So the COVID pandemic resulted in many youth learning remotely. For most youth, remote learning was less engaging, and they suffered from isolation, both from teachers, so they weren't developing that close relationship with their teacher, and also from their peers, so they weren't getting the regular social interaction that they typically would have. As a result, there's broad concern that students have suffered learning loss in both academic subjects and also in their social emotional skills. Scholars and educators have both been emphasizing the importance of addressing the trauma of the last year before focusing on academic learning. And that one way to do this is to focus on their SEL needs. So the framework that we're going to focus on today is the CASEL Social Emotional Learning Framework. CASEL stands for the Collaborative on Academic and Social Emotional Learning. And they've identified 5 competencies, each composed of a variety of social emotional skills. So I'm going to define them for you a little bit. Starting with self-management. This is the ability to manage your emotions, thoughts, and behaviors effectively across different contexts. One of the primary competencies is the ability to manage stress and also to harness your own motivation so that you can meet personal and collective goals. Self-awareness includes the ability to understand your own emotions, thoughts, and values, and how they influence your behavior across different contexts. So this includes recognizing your own strengths and limitations. Social awareness involves taking others' perspectives, empathizing, and feeling concern for others, including others from different backgrounds, cultures, and who live in different contexts. Relationship skills include the ability to establish and maintain healthy and supportive relationships, and also to effectively navigate settings with diverse individuals and groups. Students who have strong relationship skills both make and keep friends more easily, they're more able to resolve conflicts, and they make choices that support themselves and their relationships. Finally, we have responsible decision-making. And this is the ability to evaluate the likely consequences of your own actions for personal, social, and collective well-being, and then to use that evaluation to make caring and constructive choices. It's very likely that you have used many of these skills just today. And if you think about people you may know who struggle to get or keep a job or to form positive relationships, it's very possible that where they're struggling is in one or more of these SEL competencies. So the SEL and the 5 competencies are embedded within different contexts. So here in the gray concentric circles, we have 4 that have been identified as places that both youth and adults may be living and learning in. So the first one is the classroom. Classrooms are where a lot of explicit, intentional instruction on social emotional learning happens. And also, classrooms can have their own classroom climate that can be either supportive of student SEL skills and confidence, or it could be undermining. At the broader school level, we have the school culture, which again could be either supportive or not so much. And there are also policies and policies related to SEL and student well-being. Ideally, we would also extend the SEL work that's happening in the classroom and the school to families and other caregivers of our youth and to the community. Doing this provides opportunities for youth to learn about SEL across contexts, and also provides families and caregivers especially with a common vocabulary. So they're using the same words at home that kids are hearing at school, which makes it easier for children to understand what's expected of them across contexts. Okay, so SEL's promise and challenge. A critical goal for SEL is equity. So we want youth to feel safe, cared for, engaged, and we want their identities and cultural backgrounds to be represented and respected. But when SEL programs are not well understood, or teachers may be struggling with their own social emotional skills, we're not seeing these positive equity outcomes. Instead, what happens is SEL can become a new tool for demanding compliance, for managing student behavior, and also just requiring that youth all conform to white middle class expectations. So one way to address this is through systemic SEL. You get systemic SEL when you address social emotional learning across contexts. The framework for systemic SEL emphasizes that communities attend to adult SEL, school-wide SEL programs, and a continuous improvement approach. This framework describes a process with 4 central elements that can be addressed at school, district, and state levels. So to begin with, you want to really build a foundation of supports for your SEL program. And all your SEL work. And you do that by engaging stakeholders. So you want to include teachers and counselors, other staff at the school. You may want to bring in some parents, maybe people from the community. This way you're going to get really great engagement and a common vision for what SEL is going to look like. Then you want to focus on supporting educators and other adults' own SEL skills. This has positive outcomes for the adults in terms of their sense of well-being, and also helps them to be really good models and teachers of SEL for the youth. You can do this by adopting an SEL program for adults, which Tricia Moz is going to talk about. And you can also establish community of learnings, where the members are communicated to learning about and improving their SEL skills. Third, and this is probably where your mind went to off the top, is you want to adopt a program to support and foster youth SEL skills. And then, as I mentioned, ideally, you would extend this program to include families and to include the community. Fourth, you want to adopt a continuous improvement approach to ensure that the SEL program is working as intended, and to identify areas where you maybe need to make some tweaks or do some additional work. An important part of a continuous improvement approach is adopting an SEL assessment that will work in your context. So as I mentioned earlier, we're going to focus today on adult and youth SEL programs and SEL assessments. So now I'm going to hand it off to Tricia Maas, and she will talk to you about adult and youth SEL programs.
Thanks, Sherry. All right. So as Sherry introduced, we're using systemic SEL as a framework as a foundation. And really, the foundational element of that framework is all about context, right? And of course, adults play a really important role in setting contextual conditions in schools. So, to the relief of many researchers and leaders in the SEL field, we've started in recent years to see increased attention and investment in SEL for adults in education settings. But it's not necessarily intuitive what that means, adult SEL. So I've included a definition on this slide, and it comes from CASEL, which Sherry already referenced, as an organization that is a leader in the SEL field. So CASEL defines adult SEL as efforts to foster a supportive staff environment that cultivates social and emotional competence and capacities of adults in the building. So again, there's this large focus on creating an environment or context that supports well-being and SEL. But it might be helpful to further break down how adult SEL programs are designed to achieve these goals, right? They do so in a number of ways. So first, adult SEL supports educators by developing their SEL skills that Sherry mentioned, like emotion and stress management, perspective taking, and relationship skills. And these skills directly support teacher well-being and mitigate burnout, which we know comes at a high cost to both the individual teachers as well as the broader systems in which they operate. But adult SEL also supports students in a number of ways. For example, strong SEL competencies among teachers support healthy student-teacher relationships. They support the effective use of classroom management strategies and classroom climates more generally. And these classroom conditions are widely recognized to have a range of positive outcomes, including academic and social emotional learning and feelings of inclusion and belonging in the classroom. And then finally, strong adult SEL supports the implementation of social emotional learning, which we can further assist the development of youth social emotional competencies. Teachers with strong SEL skills, we know, are more likely to deliver SEL lessons, as well as implement SEL programs well through approaches like ongoing modeling, SEL reinforcement, authentic coaching, and integrating SEL into different academic content. Additionally, adult SEL has a variety of implications for how individuals experience equity in schools. As I mentioned when discussing the last slide, context shapes youth experiences as well as adult experiences related to inclusion, belonging, and equity. And of course, the adults play a large role in shaping that context, that climate. So adults' abilities to use social emotional competencies have clear implications for youth's feeling of inclusion and belonging. We also know from literature on implicit bias that when people are stressed, and here I'm thinking, teachers and leaders and adults in schools are stressed, they're more prone to cognitive biases that can lead others to feel excluded or unseen. So caring for educators' stress level also attends to equity and equity advancement in that way. Finally, building SEL competencies can help adults effectively engage in professional learning that directly aims to improve equity. And we know that this work is underway in quite a few schools and districts currently. But explicit efforts to advance equity, for anyone who's ever engaged in this work before, it's not a surprise that this work can surface tensions and be emotionally taxing. So the more social emotional skills that educators and leaders have to productively approach these conversations and this kind of professional learning, the better off they'll be to successfully and effectively engage in this work. However, despite all of these clear benefits, to date, there's still a pretty limited number of research-based options in the market to support SEL for adults in schools. So Committee for Children, the makers of Second Step, which some of you on the call are probably familiar with, recognized this need a number of years ago and began developing our newly released program, Second Step SEL for Adults. The program is designed, as you'll see in the left-hand column here, to support educators' SEL and well-being, to help schools and districts develop a positive and inclusive climate and culture, as well as to ultimately support youth SEL. And the program does so by using digitally interactive individual learning opportunities, as well as social learning opportunities, which ideally happen in person, assuming people are back in in-person realities. It also offers leadership supports because we know how important leadership is in setting a lot of these conditions in schools. The first two modules are currently available. Those modules focus on building trust and managing stress. And future modules, which focus on equity and efficacy, are scheduled to be released in 2022 with a plan to continue creating modules after that. But how do districts go about implementing adult SEL programs well? This is a new approach to professional learning, a new approach to SEL in many contexts. So there are some similarities in terms of how you would implement SEL for adults programs well in other programs. As with other programs, leaders can support implementation through ongoing communication and integration with other programs and initiatives, and through establishing and using systems of continuous learning. But additionally, just as it's useful for educators to model SEL competencies for students, it's useful for leaders in schools and districts to model those competencies for educators and staff. So in this way, SEL for adults stands apart from other programs that you might be implementing. And districts would be wise to ensure that leaders as well as educators engage to some extent with SEL for adults programming so that everyone in the community is able to model key competencies. Second, as with other kinds of program implementation, it's really important to support educator buy-in. For leaders in the field, you've probably heard and thought about supporting buy-in for years, if not decades. But this buy-in is arguably even more important when you're supporting the implementation of professional learning programs like SEL for adults, just because professional learning can feel more personal, right? It's aimed specifically at educator skills. Fortunately, research has found that soliciting and incorporating educator buy-in really early in the professional learning adoption process, and this might even be before purchase, supports the likelihood of uptake and effective use. So many communities, however, will include some very enthusiastic educators and some educators that are less enthusiastic or resistant. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's time to throw away the consideration of an SEL for adults program. Districts and systems can think strategically and creatively about how to best foster that buy-in. And one way that they might do that is by using pilots to really build buy-in and support among a smaller group of teachers and eventually spread to wider adoption. Finally, I want to highlight that SEL for adults programs are designed to support but not replace student-facing SEL programs. Adult SEL programs are helpful in establishing a supportive context for student SEL, but as I'll discuss in the next section, and as Sherry previewed earlier, SEL programming has demonstrated a number of powerful effects, and it's done so for decades. So we're not at a point where we feel it should be neglected or replaced, and nor do we anticipate ever getting to that point. So with that, let's talk about student-facing SEL programming. So in the last decade or so, as Sherry mentioned, SEL programs have received quite a bit more attention than they did previously. And the increased investment and attention reflects a number of factors, but among those factors is a highly visible, highly persuasive research base supporting SEL programming. Sherry mentioned some of the benefits that large meta-analyses have identified that are tied to SEL programming. Among them, more pro-social behavior among kids, academic success, fewer conduct problems, less emotional distress, and less drug use. But Sherry mentioned others, and that list comes from a much longer list of desirable outcomes. And these research findings are super important and they're really powerful, but I also feel like it's important to highlight that they can veil the reality that SEL programs and designs really do vary substantially, and those outcomes associated with those programs also vary pretty substantially. So that's to say, in short, not all SEL programs are created equal and see equal outcomes. So when education leaders are considering which programs to select and use, there's a couple of key considerations that they should take into account. And I'll spend much of this section talking about those two considerations. One, they should consider if programs are supported by research and evidence. Many are not, and so you want to tease that apart. And two, they should consider programs' contextual fit and support for advancing equity in their communities. So the large meta-analyses that have driven much of the advancement of SEL also identified features that differentiate more and less effective programs. And hopefully the authors have used the memorable acronym SAFE to mark these features. That is, they're intentionally sequenced, that's the S, in a logical progression. They use active learning, that's the A, to help children gain skills and knowledge. They're F, focused on developing social emotional skills, and are E, explicit about the competencies they aim to develop. Additionally, this and related research have demonstrated that SEL programs are more effective when learners engage with them over a number of years, as well as when programs provide regular opportunities for practice. So these are some key characteristics that leaders should keep in mind as being research-based when they're scanning and reviewing programs. Finally, though, some programs, second step among them, have been developed through iterative processes that involve tight partnerships with educators and students in the field. And that really ensures that when the programs are released, they're relevant, they're user-friendly, and they incorporate the realities of schools and classrooms and attend to those realities. Additionally, some programs in the second step suite, have undergone rigorous evaluations using experimental or quasi-experimental study designs. And that will help to show that they're not only research-based and founded in concepts that we know are important and useful, but they're evidence-based and have actually demonstrated benefits in the field. So very helpfully, CASEL publishes program guides that review the evidence base for various programs. And these guides summarize that existing research and evidence on various SEL programs and note things like research design, the number of studies that have been done on a particular program, key outcomes, and other things that you may want to be thinking about when considering the research and evidence base around programs that are kind of on the table for purchase. But even if a program kind of checks all of these safe boxes, and research has found that the program yields positive effects, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the perfect fit for your community. So to assess that fit, leaders might think about a couple of questions related to alignment and coherence. So they might think about whether the SEL frameworks that a particular program is built around aligns to their school and district missions and strategic plans. They should think about consistency and language consistency, as Sherry flagged earlier. Is that language consistent with assessments that you're using? This kind of previews some of what Nate and Steve will be talking about later in the presentation. Also, are is the language and are the frameworks consistent with other programs used in your community? So you might think about any programs that your out of school time space is using in your community, as well as early learning. Think about your elementary, middle, and high schools and kind of the language they're using and the framework that they're setting as a foundation. And of course, you want to look for alignment with SEL for Adults programs that you may be using as well. Finally, many districts will need to weigh resourcing and other capacity considerations like program cost. Everybody thinks about program cost, but they should also think about capacity requirements like their readiness to implement in available systems to support data collection and continuous improvement, which again, Nate and Steve will talk about a little bit more in terms of assessments, and I'll talk about a little bit more at the end of this section. So districts will also want to select a program that advances equity in their communities. And leaders should consider how programs will support the full community. So they should be thinking about the school level, the educator level, and the student level, right? This is part of that systemic approach. And as I discussed in the previous section on SEL for Adults, programs that advance equity also support feelings of inclusion, belonging, and social justice. And they do this by nurturing SEL and positive school climate for staff and students by making clear connections to lived experiences and enhancing individual and collective agency to advance social justice. So that, this looks like it just automatically advanced. So I do want to note that these bullets and these elements of equitable SEL programming come from CASEL and some of their updated guidance around transformative SEL or equitable SEL, depending on the language you're using. So I'll end this section as I did the prior with some notes about implementation. As is true when implementing SEL for Adults programs, it's important to communicate early, often, and broadly about program adoption and implementation plans. This is true for much of program implementations in districts. Additionally, to be effective, though, SEL needs to be reinforced consistently across contexts in school, and ideally across levels of school, like elementary, middle, high school. It needs to be reinforced in classrooms, lunchrooms, playgrounds, integrated with students' academic work, and modeled and practiced in the context of school-based relationships. So taking measures to support this integration across contexts and among staff members will make for much higher quality implementation. Finally, continuous improvement structures support high quality implementation. And leaders can support continuous improvement in a number of ways and through a number of different kinds of data collection and use. So for example, leaders may collect data through surveys, through focus groups. Many educators and leaders use formative assessments, and second step programs have formative assessments built directly into the program at the end of units to allow educators to quickly understand whether their kids are getting the skills and competencies in the areas that they need to revisit and reinforce. But educators can also use tools like universal screeners to support that work. So with that, I will hand it over to Nate and Steve to talk more about universal screening tools.
Thank you, Tricia. So yes, going to talk a little bit about screening, specifically universal screening. So as Tricia mentioned, assessment plays a key role within systemic SEL programming. And particularly universal screening can serve a vital function and inform some key questions as it relates to how our SEL programming is going. So we define universal screening as the use of brief assessments with a population of individuals to identify those possessing some characteristic. Universal truly means that, universal, in the sense that it's conducted across all students, not just those who have been nominated or referred, to get an understanding of how a population is doing. In this case, that characteristic of interest could be student SEL functioning. There are three core purposes of universal screening, with the first one being to identify students who are in need of additional support. So typically with universal SEL programming, the hope is that that support will be sufficient for 4 out of every 5 students on average in building social emotional competence. But it's not going to work for all students. Some students might need additional support to build those skills in this area to promote their overall mental and behavioral health. Screening would allow us to identify those students and therefore target them for additional support. Universal screening can also identify adults in additional need of support. So it might be adults with a larger number of students within their classroom that are demonstrating social emotional needs. Those teachers could be targeted for additional social emotional support themselves, or they might just be engaged in some form of skill instruction. So maybe they need additional support in the classroom management area, instructional practices, or overall strategies that improve the climate of their classroom and therefore better support student needs. And then finally, a third purpose for which we can engage in universal screening is to evaluate the efficacy of universal SEL programming. If we find over time that universal screening scores are improving, we can have greater confidence that our universal SEL programming is having its intended effect and supporting all students within the school, or as close to all as possible. Now, there's some key characteristics we look for when looking at universal screening tools and trying to decide which of these is the right one. And there's no universally perfect screening tool. Really, it depends on the circumstance and the school in question. So the first thing we look at is technical adequacy. There's some key features of technical adequacy here. The first being reliability, in the sense that would want universal screening scores to yield reliable data that is consistent across administrations over time and consistent across items within the tool. We also look for, obviously, as many might assume, validity in a tool, in the sense that the tool measures what it says to measure. If our measure is meant to evaluate student social emotional competence, it'd be great if there's peer-reviewed research that suggests that measure actually predicts that type of functioning as indicated by other measures or outcomes that are of interest to schools. Third here, and arguably one of the most important things that we look for in a screening tool is diagnostic accuracy, or what can occasionally be referred to as classification accuracy, in the sense that the tool does what it's supposed to do. It reliably differentiates those students who needed social emotional support from those students who do not need social emotional support. If there is not research suggesting that a screener yields diagnostic accuracy, we don't know if that screener can really be used for screening. So it's particularly important information. Then lastly, we also, and very importantly, look for fairness and equity in our screening scores, in the sense that our universal screener doesn't over-identify certain populations of students, say Black students or other students of color, as it relates to other areas of other demographic areas as well, so say socioeconomic status or English language learner status. In addition to technical adequacy, we also look for the usability or feasibility of a tool, in the sense that if it's going to be feasible, it shouldn't take that much to administer, shouldn't take that much time, and it should be relatively low cost. Screening is a costly procedure. We do it across all students and requires a lot of data management and data analysis, but we hope that we can keep the cost low in engaging in that practice. And also usability. At the end of the day, if the screener doesn't yield scores that are interpretable and they don't give us reports that we can easily use to inform our decision making, that screener is not going to be worth much to the school. And then lastly, we look at contextual appropriateness or contextual fit, as aligned with what Tricia was talking about as it relates to other SEL programs. We can look at contextual appropriateness in a number of ways. One of these is through alignment with constructs of interest. If a school is interested in evaluating those big 5 from CASEL, it really helps if our screener yields scores specific to those big 5. We also want to make sure it's appropriate for ages and grades. So some screeners are specific to the preschool level, some are specific to elementary, some to middle, so forth and so on. We just want to make sure there's good alignment there. Also alignment in terms of languages as well, in the sense that if our student population includes a range of students speaking different primary languages, then we hope that those measures are available in forms that are translated into multiple languages specific to those populations. And then lastly, service delivery model, in the sense that some schools want to quickly be able to say which kids need a little bit support and which kids need a lot of support. And it's helpful if our universal screeners can be used to quickly determine the level of need associated with those. I say maybe they can find students with moderate concerns and more higher concerns, as opposed to students that are just in a general concern category. So I'm going to pop it over to Nate to take it from here.
All right, thanks, Dee. I'm going to start by talking about some of the preconditions that schools should really consider before taking on any assessment. So primarily around this idea of screening readiness and getting your school ready to use those data in an actionable sense to inform your SEL programming. So one of the first questions I always ask schools is really, what do you hope to accomplish with these data? So there are no screening tools or any assessment tools that can fulfill all of your hopes and dreams, but rather you need to really think about knowing which specific question do you hope to answer, and then match that to a particular assessment tool or universal screening. The second piece is examining current capacity through resource mapping. Ultimately, an assessment tool is only as good as the decisions that are derived from that and the interventions and supports that follow. And so having a strong knowledge and background as to where are your gaps in your coverage of your intervention services as well as your current programming can really make that process much more seamless. This also involves a follow-up plan for data usage in terms of using those data to inform the intervention process. And then finally, looking a little bit further down the road is examining some of those barriers to sustainability. So next we'll talk about 3 different types of procedural considerations that schools should really dig into before going down the assessment route to selecting a particular universal screener or any other long-form assessment tool. So the first is, how often will the school screen? And again, this directly relates to the type of question that a school might be interested in addressing. So for example, if you're looking at the efficacy of your universal SEL program, well, screening 3 times a year might give you that change in data you might be looking for that can really help to evaluate that universal programming. Alternatively, if you're primarily using that screening tool to inform some additional level of service, that more intensive classroom or group level of service, you might only need to screen twice a year, given some of the stability research out there in terms of when students are identified in need for services. So it's really important to consider your teaching and personnel staff and what might be most acceptable to them, considering some of their other demands on their time, as well as some of the limited resources that might be present within that school. The second area of procedural considerations is this idea of who's going to be the primary informant. In many schools, and I would often say most schools, teachers are that primary informant when completing a universal screening. That goes kindergarten almost all the way through high school. Now, I would consider that for schools to offer to consider when screening should be completed within middle and high schools, often with 5, 6, or 7 teachers, that student self-report also be incorporated into that mix. Now, more data doesn't necessarily mean better data, but it could certainly be indicative of something else that would be going on with that particular student that the teacher just does not have access to. So really having that opportunity to get that student's perspective can be an incredibly valuable voice and engagement of that perspective within the intervention planning and programming. Home or parent reporting is also have been integral over this last year and a half, as so many schools have gone to virtual environments and schools and students have been learning within that home environment. So many schools are often looking at kind of that parent perspective of how we can engage multiple perspectives in that planning. And then lastly, before administering universal screeners or really any kind of assessment tool to multiple perspectives, it's important to know what to do with potentially, and I would say likely, discrepant data. So in other words, if a teacher says one thing, a student says another, and a parent says another, what are you going to do with those data? And just because those data are different doesn't mean that they're a noisy data, but it could be more of a signal as to a student's level of performance or need within different settings. And then lastly, for the last procedural consideration, is really how do you plan to use those data to improve and promote student equity? And this is a question that we get quite often when it comes to universal screening. There's a couple different ways to do that. First, we go by the model that a tool should be technically adequate and strong. So as Steve had mentioned, this should be really important to have a psychometrically strong assessment tool in terms of measurement and variance. That means basically, does the tool perform equally well across different demographic groups? The second piece is disaggregating your data. That is using your data as a powerful way to see if there are performance differences across your different student groups as a way to improve and target your intervention programming. And then lastly, it's really important to acknowledge the influence of rater perception and an implicit bias on your assessment data. That is, we all carry our respective and individual biases that will influence those data. We also say that you can have a really fantastic assessment tool, but junk data in is junk data out. So acknowledging the influence of perception and how that is reflected within those data. One way, for example, to tackle that challenge is to have explicit training on the nature and presence of what those behaviors might look like in different settings for your raters to help them calibrate those perspectives. So those are just a couple of the procedural considerations that schools might be looking for when addressing the assessment piece of this. Now I'm going to turn it back over to Sherry to wrap us up.
Great, thanks, Nate. So I feel like we've given you all a lot of really great information. So in this last slide, I just want to reiterate some of the key takeaways. So when you're thinking about systemic SEL and adopting SEL programs in your context, the first thing you want to do is to identify your stakeholders, get them engaged, and get their buy-in so that everybody is moving forward with the same plan. Then you want to focus on adult social emotional learning. Doing so will result in both personal and professional benefits for your educators and staff. They'll be better able to teach the SEL curricula that you select for your youth, and they will be able to better model SEL skills for their students. Then you want to think about the youth SEL curriculum that you're going to choose. Remember to look for one that's research-based and evidence-based, that it matches your mission, that it's safe. So the lessons are sequenced, active, focused, and explicit. And then also think about how you're going to assess the effects or the outcomes related to your SEL programs. As you just heard, you want to make sure that the assessment that you choose has can identify students who may be in need of additional SEL support. You want to also identify adults within your context who might also need additional support, whether that's SEL or classroom management and that kind of thing. And you also want to be able to evaluate the efficacy of universal SEL programs in your school. And just to remind you once again that we have written a white paper that will be available in this fall, probably in October, and everyone who participated in the webinar will receive a copy of it. Thanks very much, everybody.
All righty. Well, a big thanks to all of our panelists today. This has been such an information-packed webinar, lots of great guidance that we can start applying as we look ahead to the new school year. And you've already done it. I was going to invite all the panelists to come back on with Sherry and I to for the Q&A, and we are here. So we do have some questions, and I'm going to jump right in. So this one's addressed to Tricia, Steve, and Nate. Do assessments exist that consider adult SEL?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll let Steve and Nate jump into this as well. The adult SEL field is still pretty young. There are a range of assessments. There are a range of survey instruments really that you can use, and we have built into some of our implementation guidance for the SEL for Adults program. So we have a document called the Evaluation Guide in our SEL for Adults program, and it points to some tested surveys that are tightly tied to the outcomes that we expect to see from the SEL for Adults program. Many of them would require you to, administer them pencil and paper or put them into some like SurveyMonkey or other platform like that. But right now, I think we're still at the frontier of building out assessments for SEL for adults. Nate and Steve, what do you got?
Yeah, I definitely agree, Tricia. I think it's because it's such a new field. Usually the assessment design and development usually lags a year or two after that. That being said, I would also ask kind of what are you hoping to accomplish with measuring adult SEL, and are there other indicators that might be something that would be of interest in evaluating those programming?
Yeah, so in our assessment guide, I'll build on that a little bit. We have instruments for assessing adult stress, adult well-being, relationships, collegial relationships, as well as student-teacher relationships. So, in terms of adoption and implementation, I would encourage district leaders to build out a theory of change as they approach their SEL work. And that really spells out, okay, we have these different interventions and we expect to see these outcomes. And you can find our theory of change for SEL for adults publicly available, I believe. But really, we're focused on educator well-being, and like I said in the first two modules, stress and relationships trust. So those are kind of our primary outcomes, and then we expect that to lead to stronger climate and culture, and then more distally, student SEL and academic competencies eventually.
Excellent. Steve, did you have anything to add to that?
No,
great
just,
answers.
No, yeah, that's fantastic. I think it's a little bit of a nascent field, particularly in relation to student SEL assessments. I have a former doctoral student that's working on her dissertation on that, so I'll wait a few years and we'll have that. They'll be added to the category. But in the meantime, yeah, still some good work to be done.
Excellent. All right, our next question is for Tricia. It's a multi-parter here, so I'll get through it. Do the second step modules have assessments? We use the out of school program for second step, but we didn't see any formative assessments. Has that changed? We'd like to have some formative assessments, and if there are those, who has validated the scales?
Okay, so I think I got all of that. Yes, we have formative assessments built in via performance tasks. So they might not look as technical, and they're not, validated. We don't expect that folks to be using them as any sort of like summative measure, and we wouldn't even expect folks to really track it over time and look at student growth over time using those formative assessments. What they're designed to do is to give educators tools to reflect on whether their kids have gotten the skills and competencies that they just taught in that unit. So in the K-5 program, the middle school program, and the OST program, you'll see those performance tasks, which are formative assessments, at the end of every unit. And they're so embedded that it may not even seem that that's what they are, but you'll also see some rubrics and reflection tools that help educators to use those performance tasks and reflect on whether kids have gotten the information that they need. So I think, did that cover all of them? All of the questions?
Yes, I believe so. That's fantastic. All right, next question for Steve. Does the SABRE screener align to CASEL?
As I try to unmute, it's in the sense that it doesn't have specific alignment and that the subscales corresponds perfectly with the CASEL 5. However, we do know that the overall score that we get as it corresponds to social, emotional, and behavioral functioning is well correlated with other measures of social emotional competence. So we have high confidence that it may not tease out exactly which area in which a student might be lacking in terms of those big 5, but the overall score is really predictive of overall social emotional competence. Also available on the FastBridge website is greater information about how the specific items on the SABREs align with the CASEL 5. So we can do a walkthrough in a very nicely graphically designed webpage that is beyond what Nate and I are capable of doing, but shows alignment between SABRE's items and some of the CASEL domains.
Excellent. All right, next question we have is for Nate. How often would you recommend that students self-report, and do parents need to be informed of these assessments?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And certainly when it comes to the frequency of student self-report, and not to punt back to my prior response of it kind of depends on what you're hoping to accomplish. When it comes to student self-report, certainly there are different levels of consent and assent required. And I would ask that you consider your legal and ethical requirements by your particular district. Now, different states have different requirements, particularly with teacher-completed screeners as generally acceptable with an opt-out procedure or a parental notification procedure. There are districts, of course, that do use student self-report as well, but it's less about the actual tool that you use and more about what data is derived from that tool and how that data is then used. So for example, with the universal screening, these aren't made for individual decisions. They're instead used for overall evaluation of programming and potential intervention grouping at the tier 2 intervention classroom level. So I think it really depends on kind of how you use those data, less than about the actual tool that you use. The second piece, I would say, in terms of the frequency, it's really important that students certainly are able to voice their concerns, voice their needs through any assessment tool, but also knowing that if you're looking at the change in a particular intervention, to give that at least 6 to 8 weeks in between assessments.
Alrighty, excellent, thank you. Alrighty, well, it looks like that is all the time that we have for questions today. So this hour went by super fast. I learned a lot. And so we really appreciate everyone's participation in today's webinar. And again, once again, a huge thank you to our presenters for sharing their expertise. We at Illuminate want to thank you for attending today and for the work that you do each and every day with your students and helping young people grow. As you plan your behavior and SEL programming for the fall, the FastBridge assessment system can help ensure all students in your district and school receive the social, emotional, and behavioral support they need to be successful. So if you'd like to see how the system works, you can request a demo at fastbridge.org. And with that, I'd like to say thanks so much for attending. Appreciate your time today, and we hope you all have a wonderful day.